Bridgewater Associates founder, meanwhile, Ray Dalio, warning that the U.S. and China's relationship is, quote, on the brink of red lines. But that war between the two nations is unlikely, says Dalio. He claims, quote, the breaking point is if the United States said we are in favor of the independence of Taiwan. That's the equivalent of declaration of war, according to Dalio. His comments coming ahead of a bipartisan Senate delegation trip to China next week. The lawmakers reportedly hoping to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Joining me right now to talk more about that is the Atlas Organization founder and author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward. Jonathan, I want to talk to you about all of this. You've been so great on the threat of communist China. Let's take on Ray Dalio first, because sometimes I feel like he is actually talking about things that Xi Jinping wants him to talk about. Is he the messenger telling us we better not say that the U.S. is in favor of Taiwan independence?
Well, look, Dalio is well known as sort of, an apologist for the Communist Party of China. I mean, he's got a pretty deep well of writing and speaking on that. I mean, the kinds of things he's said in support of their human rights atrocities and that sort of thing has, I think, been astonishing to many people. And he also, at the same time, I think, is expressing a level of risk here that may be beneficial in the finance community, in the sense that if people are listening to him and starting to hear that China's a riskier destination, I think that's very important. So people do listen to Dalio. I think they've listened to him for the wrong reasons for a lot of the time. But now at this point, I mean, I think he's just saying, look, this is all getting very, very risky. And his theory of history, I think in some ways I share the view that economic power ultimately produces geopolitical power. The difference being for him, that's a way to make money on China. For me, that's something that you have to stop. You have to stop the economic rise of China so that they don't get the geopolitical power. But when he's speaking to groups of investors like this and they're starting to hear how risky it is, hopefully there's a positive effect.
Well, hopefully he's starting to understand the national security risks that we talk about every single day. Now you've got Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying that the U.S. has become overly dependent on China, you think, for critical supply chains, and that the U.S. needs to broaden its sources of supply. Yellen claims we're particularly dependent on China for clean energy products, Jonathan, as they push their climate change agenda. Yesterday, we did a whole story on how dependent we are on the underlying components, the active ingredients in our pharmaceutical drugs. Yes, there's critical minerals as well. Your thoughts?
Well, look, I think Yellen is someone who seems to be going up the learning curve here a bit, but in the same speech, it was at the Fortune CEO Summit, she said we don't want decoupling with China. So I think there's just a lack of clarity in her, understanding of the China situation. I mean, on one hand, she recognizes that there is this dependency and that that's dangerous. That's absolutely true. On the other hand, how are you actually going to solve that? I mean, that comes through strategic decoupling. So I think, she's not sending clear signals to the business community, which you would need to do as the Treasury Secretary. I mean, this is one of the most important strategic departments in an economic contest. It's vital to national security, really. And to see her sort of going back and forth in terms of what she understands, I think, is concerning. But at least it's showing some of the risks to the business community, if not clear direction.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue here is that they have for so long given the Wall Street executives and business executives sort of the go-ahead, in so many words, to go open up in China and condone some of the things that we're talking about, the aggression from communist China. But now the Department of Justice has announced indictments and sanctions against 8 China-based companies and 12 Chinese nationals for their role in what they're calling the trafficking of precursors used to make fentanyl. The Treasury Department also sanctioning 28 people and entities, it says, were part of a drug trafficking network, Jonathan. So they're obviously acknowledging that the fentanyl is coming from China and pushing back on it. Is this enough?
Well, look, apparently this is part of what's now called a whole-of-government approach to the fentanyl crisis. So that's incredibly important. But we should talk about fentanyl for a minute. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention said earlier this year that 77,000 overdose deaths between May of 2022 and April of 2023 have come from primarily fentanyl-related substances. And the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency has told us that nearly all of the precursors come from China. So now we're getting into a situation where the fentanyl deaths in just 1 year are double the deaths of U.S. servicemen in the Korean War. They exceed the deaths of U.S. servicemen in Vietnam, and they're actually more than the combined killed in action deaths of both Korea and Vietnam. So,
wow.
so this is just insane. And the Chinese embassy said this about the sanctions that the DOJ put on these entities in China. This is the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We firmly oppose the United States' sanction and prosecution against Chinese entities and individuals, and the severe infringement of the lawful rights and interests of the relevant enterprises and persons. Imposing pressure and sanctions cannot solve the United States' own problems. It will only create obstacles to the U.S. China cooperation on drug control. So we're talking about something that is so destructive. It literally exceeds the war KIA from two major conflicts in the Cold War. It's all coming from China. I mean, it's an act of total hostility, I would say, at this point.
Yeah.
And to think that we're still engaged economically with a place that is supplying the ingredients to kill tens of thousands of Americans on a yearly basis, boggles the mind.
Well, they got away with COVID. I mean, they had a massive cover-up over COVID. They still won't admit that it leaked from a lab. And then you've got the propaganda. You and I talked about this propaganda earlier, that one of the mouthpieces of China tweets out, China does not allow the drug problem to haunt the nation and kill 100,000 people per year. So they're mocking the United States. Meanwhile, the drug is coming from China.
Right. The official spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mocks the 100,000 deaths a year in the United States.
On social media. Unbelievable. Jonathan, good to see
Twitter.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks very
Thank you.
much. Jonathan